The day I buried my father, I found a locked box in his desk. What was inside didn't just end my faith, it erased the woman I thought I was for 52 years. I need you to understand something before I tell you what was in that box. I need you to understand who I was, who I had been trained to be since before I could form memories of my own. My name is Rachel Whitmore, and I grew up in Provo, Utah, in a house where the portrait of Jesus hung across from the portrait of the current prophet, and both watched over our dinner table like silent judges. My father, Grant Whitmore, was a bishop for 11 years. My mother, Caroline, was the kind of Relief Society president other women whispered about with envy. Her casseroles were legendary, her visiting teaching numbers were impeccable, and her children were scrubbed and scripture-ready every Sunday morning without fail. I was the oldest of 6. The daughter. The example. From the time I could walk, I understood my purpose. I was to be sweet, obedient, and temple-worthy. I was to keep my shoulders covered and my questions to myself. I was to prepare for my ultimate calling, wife and mother in Zion, sealed for time and all eternity to a worthy priesthood holder who would lead our family to the celestial kingdom. I did everything right. I attended seminary at 6 in the morning all 4 years of high school, half asleep but present, filling in the blanks of my scripture mastery cards. I earned my Young Women medallion. I went to Brigham Young University, where I studied elementary education because it was practical for a mother, and because my father said a degree was insurance in case something happened to my future husband. I met David Whitmore. Yes, same last name, no relation, and everyone thought it was a sign from God, in my freshman ward. We dated for 4 months. We were engaged for 2. We were married in the Provo Temple 3 weeks after my 19th birthday. I remember standing in that sealing room, surrounded by mirrors that reflected into infinity, and the sealer telling us that our marriage would last not just until death, but forever. I looked at David across the altar, his hand in mine, and I felt what I was supposed to feel. Gratitude, peace, and the absolute certainty that I was exactly where God wanted me to be. 22 years old and already a mother of 2. 28 and a mother of 4. 33 and a mother of 5, with a calling in primary that consumed 20 hours of my week. 38 and teaching early morning seminary to teenagers, while my own teenagers rolled their eyes at family scripture study. 45 and watching my youngest leave for his mission to Argentina, crying at the airport, telling myself these were tears of joy. I was the woman my mother had trained me to be. I was the woman the church had designed. And if you had asked me at any point during those 3 decades whether I was happy, I would have said yes without hesitation, because I didn't know the difference between happiness and obedience. I didn't know there was a difference. My father died on a Tuesday in October, heart attack. He was 76 years old, still serving as a temple worker, still bearing his testimony on the first Sunday of every month with tears streaming down his weathered face. At his funeral, the stake president called him a giant of faith and a pillar of the community. 200 people filled the chapel. The overflow room was standing room only. I sat in the front row with my mother and my siblings, accepting condolences, hearing story after story about my father's kindness, his service, his unwavering testimony. I cried the tears expected of a grieving daughter. I said the things expected of a woman raised to perform grief the same way she performed everything else, gracefully, modestly, and without making anyone uncomfortable. 3 days later, my mother asked me to help clean out my father's study. The study was a small room at the back of their house in Provo, lined with bookshelves full of scripture commentaries and church history volumes published by Deseret Book. A framed photo of the Salt Lake Temple hung above his desk. His missionary plaque from 1966, Germany Frankfurt Mission, sat on a shelf next to a collection of general conference talks he'd saved since the 1980s. I was sorting through his desk drawers, separating documents into piles, financial records here, church materials there, personal letters in a box for my mother to review later, when I noticed the false bottom. I almost missed it. The drawer was deep, and I was moving quickly, and I had already filled 2 garbage bags with old ward directories and outdated temple recommend holders. But something about the weight felt wrong. The drawer was heavier than it should have been for what was inside. I pulled the drawer out completely and turned it over. The bottom panel was loose. Underneath it was a metal lockbox about the size of a shoebox, painted the same brown as the drawer to blend in. My hands were shaking as I lifted it out. It was locked with a small combination padlock, the kind you'd use for a school locker. I don't know why I didn't call my mother. I don't know why I didn't set it aside and wait. Something in me, some voice I had spent 52 years learning to silence, told me to open it alone. I tried my father's birthday. Nothing. My mother's birthday. Nothing. Their anniversary. The lock clicked open. Inside were 7 documents. Letters, mostly. A few official-looking papers. A photograph I didn't recognize. And a small notebook with my father's handwriting on the cover. For Rachel. When I'm gone. I sat on the floor of my dead father's study, surrounded by the debris of his faithful life, and I began to read. The first document was a letter dated 1923, written by my great-grandfather Thomas Whitmore to his brother in Pennsylvania. The letter was brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. I had to read it 3 times before I understood what I was seeing. My family's conversion story, the story I had heard at every family reunion, every testimony meeting, every missionary discussion I'd ever participated in, was a lie. According to family legend, my great-grandfather Thomas had been a hard-drinking railroad worker in Pennsylvania when 2 Mormon missionaries knocked on his door in 1921. He'd tried to chase them away, but they kept coming back. One night, he had a dream where an angel told him the Book of Mormon was true. He was baptized the next month, moved his family to Utah, and never touched alcohol again. It was a miracle. It was proof of God's hand in our family's destiny. It was the foundation of everything we believed about ourselves. But the letter told a different story. Thomas Whitmore had moved to Utah because he'd gotten a woman pregnant in Pennsylvania, a woman who was not his wife. The Mormons offered him a fresh start, a new community, a new identity, a place where no one knew his past. The conversion wasn't spiritual, it was strategic. The angel in the dream was a convenient story he invented later, when his children started asking questions, when the mythology became more useful than the truth. I sat there on the floor, holding a letter that turned 90 years of family history into a marketing campaign. Every tearful testimony my father had borne about our pioneer ancestors. Every time he'd told me I came from covenant stock. Every lesson about legacy and lineage and the importance of keeping our family worthy of the celestial kingdom. All of it built on a lie a desperate man told to escape his mistakes. I wanted to believe it wasn't true. I wanted to find some explanation, some context that would make this letter mean something other than what it clearly said. But I knew my great-grandfather's handwriting from other family documents. I knew the names he mentioned. I knew the details were too specific, too mundane, too real to be fabricated. My hands were trembling as I set the letter aside and reached for the second document. That letter was just the first document. The second one had my name on it. The second document was a spreadsheet. Dozens of pages, handwritten in my father's meticulous script, tracking every tithing payment he had made since 1972. 51 years of donations, organized by month with running totals at the bottom of each page. I had always known my family paid tithing, 10% of our income every month without exception. It was as automatic as breathing, as unquestionable as gravity. Tithing is fire insurance, my father used to say, quoting some general authority. You pay it or you burn. He'd laugh when he said it, but there was no joke in his eyes. What I didn't know, what I had never been allowed to know, was the actual number. $423,000. I counted the columns 3 times because I was certain I'd made a mistake. But my father was nothing if not precise. He'd even adjusted for inflation in a separate column, calculating what each year's donations would be worth in current dollars. The adjusted total was over $600,000. $600,000 given to the church over 51 years. I thought about my childhood. I thought about the secondhand clothes my mother sewed patches into when the knees wore through. I thought about the used car my father drove for 18 years because it still runs fine, Rachel, and the Lord doesn't care what we drive. I thought about my brother Michael, the smartest of all of us, who'd gotten into Stanford but went to BYU instead because we just can't swing it financially, son, but BYU is the Lord's university. Michael never complained. None of us did. We believed we were poor. We believed our family was making sacrifices because that's what faithful families do. We believed that someday, in the celestial kingdom, we'd be rewarded for every meal of rice and beans, every vacation we didn't take, every opportunity we quietly surrendered. But we weren't poor. We were funding an institution that owns billions in assets, that builds shopping malls and luxury housing developments, that pays no taxes and reports to no one. We were giving 10% of everything my father ever earned to an organization that could have paid for Michael's Stanford education out of petty cash and never noticed the difference. I found myself doing math I'd never done before. If my father had invested that money instead of donating it, even in a simple index fund, even at modest returns, our family would have had over $1 million. My mother wouldn't have waited 2 years for her hip replacement surgery because the deductible is just too high right now. My sister wouldn't have declared bankruptcy after her divorce because there was no family safety net to catch her. My father wouldn't have died still working part-time at 76 because his retirement savings were thinner than I'd hoped. The church teaches that tithing brings blessings. Prove me now herewith, the scripture says, and see if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing so great you cannot contain it. I had believed that my whole life. I had paid my own tithing faithfully for over 30 years, never questioning, never calculating, never daring to wonder what else that money could have done. But sitting there with my father's spreadsheet in my hands, the only blessing I could see was the blessing the church had received. A lifetime of my father's labor, converted to cash, deposited into accounts I would never see, used for purposes I would never know. I set the spreadsheet aside and picked up a small notebook, the kind my father used for his church assignments. Inside were detailed logs of every calling he'd held since his mission, with estimates of hours spent on each one. Elders Quorum President, approximately 15 hours per week for 3 years. Executive Secretary to the Bishop, 20 hours per week for 4 years. Bishop, 30 hours per week for 11 years. High Counselor, 10 hours per week for 6 years. Temple Worker, 8 hours per week for the last 12 years of his life. He'd totaled it all at the bottom of the last page, 15,462 hours. I did the math. That's almost 2 full years of 40-hour work weeks. But it didn't happen in 2 years. It was spread across 4 decades, which meant something different. It meant every Saturday morning, every Tuesday evening, every Sunday from 7 in the morning until sometimes 9 at night. It meant my father was physically present in our home but mentally absent, always preparing a lesson, always counseling a struggling ward member, always attending meetings about meetings about meetings. I remembered being 8 years old and wanting my father to come to my school play. He couldn't. Bishopric meeting. I remembered being 16 and wanting to talk to him about a boy I liked. He was on the phone with a recent convert who was having doubts. I remembered being 32, visiting my parents with my own children, watching my kids play in the backyard while my father sat in his study, preparing his Sunday school lesson. The church needs him, my mother always said. Your father is doing the Lord's work. But I needed him too. And I never said it. I never even let myself think it. Because what kind of selfish daughter competes with God for her father's attention? I thought about my own callings. I thought about the years I spent in primary, cutting out paper figures and rehearsing songs with other people's children, while my own children watched television in the next room. I thought about the early morning seminary years, waking at 5 to teach teenagers who didn't want to be there, coming home exhausted to a family that had learned to make their own breakfasts and pack their own lunches because mom was serving the Lord. If stories like this resonate with you, you're not alone. Join this community by subscribing. There are many more untold stories waiting to be shared. I added up my own hours once, years ago, on a sleepless night when I was drowning in my Relief Society calling. The number frightened me so much I threw away the paper and never calculated again. But sitting in my father's study, holding his meticulous records, I couldn't hide from the arithmetic anymore. The church doesn't ask for 10% of your income. It asks for 10% of your income and 10% of your time and 10% of your thoughts and 10% of your relationships and 10% of your identity, and then it asks for 10% more and then more again, until you look up one day and realize there's nothing left that belongs to you. Everything has been tithed. Everything has been consecrated. You are a hollow vessel filled entirely with someone else's purpose. My father gave the church $400,000 and 15,000 hours, and his children's Saturday mornings, and his wife's companionship, and his own doubts and questions and curiosity. And what did he get in return? A funeral where strangers talked about how great he was. A legacy of sacrifice that his children would be expected to continue. An eternal reward that no one could prove existed. I was crying now, though I hadn't noticed when the tears started. The notebook was getting damp. I set it down carefully and wiped my face with my sleeve. There were still more documents in the box. Part of me wanted to close the lid and walk away. Part of me wanted to burn everything and pretend I'd never seen it. But I could feel my father's presence in that room, not as a ghost, but as an absence, a negative space in the shape of all the hours he didn't spend with me, all the conversations we didn't have, all the questions he never asked because asking wasn't allowed. I reached for the next document. It was a folder containing letters between my father and his stake president, dated 1994. The subject line on the first letter made my blood run cold. Regarding Brother Whitmore's testimony concerns. My father had doubts. My father, the bishop, the pillar, the giant of faith, had questioned the church, and someone had written it down. I opened the folder, not knowing it would be the last time I'd see my father as the man I thought he was. The letters were dated between March and September of 1994. I would have been 23 years old then, newly married to David, pregnant with our first child. I remember that year as one of the happiest of my life. I was finally fulfilling my divine purpose, finally becoming the mother I'd been raised to be. I had no idea that while I was decorating a nursery and reading church-approved parenting books, my father was fighting for his soul in secret. The first letter was from my father to President Harold Jennings, his stake president at the time. I recognized the name. President Jennings had spoken at my wedding reception, had blessed my first baby, had been a constant presence at our family gatherings until he moved to Arizona in the late 90s. I'd always thought of him as a kind man. The letter began formally, as all church correspondence does, but quickly became something else. My father wrote that he'd been studying church history, the real history, he called it, not the correlated version, and had encountered information that troubled him deeply. He mentioned the multiple accounts of the first vision. He mentioned the translation process of the Book of Mormon, how Joseph Smith had placed a seer stone in a hat and buried his face in it, not using the gold plates at all. He mentioned polygamy, not just the fact of it, but the ages of some of Joseph Smith's wives, some as young as 14. He mentioned the Book of Abraham, how the papyri Joseph claimed to translate had been rediscovered and found to be common Egyptian funerary documents with no connection to Abraham whatsoever. I have served this church faithfully for 26 years, my father wrote. I have given everything I have, but I cannot reconcile what I now know with what I have taught. I feel I am living a lie, and I don't know how to continue. I read that sentence 5 times. My father, the bishop. My father who bore his testimony with tears streaming down his face. My father who told me the church was the only true church on earth. Who warned me that people who left were deceived by Satan. Who said he knew that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. He had doubted. He had known the same things I would later discover. And he had never, not once in the 28 years between that letter and his death, said a word to me about any of it. President Jennings's response came 2 weeks later. It was 4 pages long, and reading it felt like being slowly submerged in ice water. The stake president acknowledged my father's concerns but dismissed them methodically. The multiple first vision accounts showed Joseph's growing understanding of his experience. The seer stone was a faith-promoting detail that demonstrates God can use simple instruments. The young brides were a product of their time, and we should not judge 19th century practices by modern standards. The Book of Abraham was translated by revelation, not by scholarly means, so the content of the papyri is irrelevant. Then came the warnings. Brother Whitmore, I must counsel you strongly against continuing this line of inquiry. The adversary uses intellectual pride to destroy testimonies. You have been blessed with significant callings and responsibilities. Many ward members look to you as an example. If you were to express these doubts publicly, or even privately to your family, the damage could be immeasurable. President Jennings reminded my father of his temple covenants. He reminded him of the law of consecration, how he had promised to give everything to the church, including his intellect. He reminded him that his wife and children were sealed to him for eternity, but those sealing blessings were contingent on faithfulness. I would hate to see your family's eternal destiny jeopardized by historical curiosities that have been addressed by faithful scholars. Put these questions on the shelf, brother. Some things are not meant to be understood in this life. There were more letters. My father pushed back, gently at first, then more desperately. He asked how he could teach things he no longer believed were true. He asked how he could counsel ward members to pay tithing when he now knew about the church's billions in investments. He asked how he could sit across from 16-year-old girls in worthiness interviews, asking them about their sexual purity, when he knew the man who started this religion had married girls their age. President Jennings's final letter was brutal in its kindness. Grant, I love you like a brother. But I must be direct. If you continue on this path, I will have no choice but to convene a disciplinary council. You will lose your calling. You will lose your temple recommend. Your family will know, and they will be devastated. Your wife, your children, they will look at you differently. Some of them may never recover their faith. Is your intellectual curiosity worth your family? Is being right worth being alone? There was one more document in the folder. A letter my father had written but never sent. It was addressed to me. The paper was different from the others, softer, more personal. He'd used his good stationery, the kind he saved for important occasions. The date at the top was September 15th, 1994, 2 weeks before President Jennings's final warning. My dearest Rachel, he began. I'm writing this letter knowing I may never give it to you. But I need to write it anyway, because I need someone to know the truth, even if that someone is only a future version of myself who might find this and remember. I have discovered things about our church that I cannot unknow. I have learned that the history I taught you, the stories I told you, the foundation of everything our family believes, much of it is not what I thought it was. I feel like a man who has been living in a beautiful house, only to discover it was built on sand. The house still looks the same. The furniture is still comfortable. Your mother still hums hymns in the kitchen, but I can see the cracks now, and I cannot unsee them. I wanted to tell you. I wanted to sit down with you and your brothers and sisters and explain what I found, to give you the chance to investigate for yourselves, to make your own choices. But President Jennings has made it clear what will happen if I do. I will lose everything, not just my calling, but my marriage, my family, my entire community. Your mother would never understand. She would see it as betrayal. And you are so happy right now, so full of faith and hope, expecting your first child, beginning the life you were raised to live. How could I take that from you? So I have made my choice. I will put these questions on the shelf, as President Jennings instructed. I will continue to serve. I will continue to teach. I will bear my testimony even when the words feel like ash in my mouth. I will protect you from the truth because I love you too much to watch your world crumble the way mine has. I hope I am making the right decision. I hope that somehow the doubts will fade. I hope that the shelf will hold. But if you ever find this letter, if you ever discover what I discovered, please know that I am sorry. I am sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you. I am sorry I chose comfort over honesty, peace over truth. I am sorry I let fear make my decisions. You deserve better than the life I have given you. You deserve to choose for yourself. All my love, always, Dad. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, or I was spinning, or the whole world had tilted on its axis and I was the only one who noticed. My father had known. For 28 years, he had known everything, the historical problems, the financial questions, the manipulation and control, and he had said nothing. He had watched me raise my children in the same system that had trapped him. He had attended their baptisms and their ordinations and their mission farewells, bearing testimony with tears in his eyes, and it was all performance. All of it. A man going through motions he no longer believed in because the cost of honesty was too high. Have you ever felt trapped between who you were supposed to be and who you really are? Share your experience in the comments below. I thought I knew my father. I thought I understood his faith, his sacrifices, his unwavering commitment to the gospel. But the man who wrote that letter was a stranger, a prisoner in a cage of his own making, watching his children inherit the same bars, unable to speak, unable to warn us, unable to do anything but hope we would someday find our way out on our own. The shelf didn't hold. It never does. It just waits, collecting weight, until one day it collapses and everything comes crashing down. I set down my father's unsent letter and reached for the 5th document. My hands were steady now, though they shouldn't have been. Something inside me had shifted, hardened. I was no longer the grieving daughter searching for closure. I was an investigator searching for the truth, and I was ready for whatever came next. I was not ready for what came next. The 5th document was a letter from my father to David's parents, dated January 1989. 6 months before David and I met, a year before we were married. The subject line read, "Regarding the proposal for our children's courtship." And just like that, my 31-year marriage became a crime scene. I read the letter 3 times before my brain accepted what my eyes were seeing. My father had written to Richard and Elaine Whitmore, David's parents, proposing a match between their son and his daughter. The language was formal, almost contractual. He described me as a faithful young woman of good temperament and strong testimony, well-suited for motherhood and supportive of priesthood leadership. He described David as a returned missionary with excellent prospects and a family line of faithful temple workers. He suggested that our meeting could be arranged naturally, through mutual friends at BYU, so that neither David nor I would suspect the true origin of our courtship. There were practical considerations. Both families would benefit from the connection. The Whitmores had business interests that could help my father, and my father had church connections that could help David's advancement. Our children would inherit covenant bloodlines on both sides. It was, my father wrote, an opportunity to strengthen Zion through intentional family building. At the bottom of the letter, in different ink, someone had written, "Agreed. Richard will speak to David. Elaine will coordinate with Caroline. Target introduction, September." September 1989. The exact month I met David in my freshman ward at BYU. The exact month I thought God had answered my prayers and sent me my eternal companion. I thought about that first meeting. A ward social in the cultural hall, awkward name tags and store-bought cookies. David had approached me near the punch bowl, complimented my dress, asked about my major. I'd felt a spark, not fireworks, but something warm and comfortable, something that felt like recognition. Maybe we knew each other in the pre-existence. I'd told my roommate later that night, giddy and hopeful. Maybe God is telling me something. God wasn't telling me anything. My father was telling David's father to send his son to talk to me near the punch bowl. Every flutter in my stomach, every answered prayer I thought I'd received, every confirmation that David was the one, all of it was manufactured. I was a product being marketed to a buyer who had already agreed to the purchase. I thought about our courtship, how easy it had been. How David always seemed to know the right things to say, the right places to take me, the right moments to express his feelings. I thought I was lucky. I thought I had found a man who truly understood me. But David didn't understand me. David had been briefed on me. He knew my favorite flowers because our mothers had talked. He knew my concerns about marriage because my father had shared them. He knew exactly how to make me feel chosen because he had been given a script, and I had been too naive, too trusting, too desperate for the fairy tale to notice I was reading from a script too. My stomach heaved. I barely made it to the bathroom before I vomited, my body rejecting what my mind couldn't process. 31 years, 5 children, thousands of nights in the same bed, thousands of meals at the same table, a lifetime of memories I thought were built on love, built on a transaction. Built on 2 fathers trading children like livestock, securing alliances like medieval kings, playing God with lives that were never theirs to arrange. When I could stand again, I went back to the study. There were 2 more documents in the box, but I already knew the worst was behind me. Nothing could hurt more than learning your entire marriage was a lie. Nothing could cut deeper than realizing the man you'd slept beside for 3 decades had known, the whole time, that you hadn't chosen him at all. The 6th document was a family photograph I'd never seen before. It showed my father as a young man, maybe 25, standing with a woman I didn't recognize. She had dark hair and a bright smile, and her arm was around my father's waist with an ease that spoke of intimacy. On the back, someone had written, Grant and Margaret, 1969. 3 years before my father married my mother. I had never heard of anyone named Margaret. I turned the photograph over again, studying the woman's face. There was something familiar about her jaw, her eyes. And then I realized she looked like my Aunt Ruth, my father's sister, the one who had died before I was born, the one no one ever talked about. Except Aunt Ruth hadn't died. The 7th document told me that. It was a letter from 1975, typed on official church letterhead, informing my father that his sister Ruth had been excommunicated for conduct unbecoming a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A handwritten note in the margin, in my grandmother's writing, said, "Do not speak of her again. She is dead to this family." Ruth's crime, I would later learn, was loving another woman. In 1974, she had left her husband and moved to Seattle with her partner, a woman named Grace. The family had erased her completely, removed her from photographs, deleted her from stories, pretended she had never existed. For 50 years, I had believed my father was an only child after his brother died in Vietnam. I had never known I had an aunt who was still alive, still out there, still carrying the weight of a family that had chosen doctrine over love. I found Ruth 3 days later through an internet search. She was 78 years old, living in a small apartment in Capitol Hill with a cat named Delilah. Grace had died in 2015. Ruth had never remarried, never returned to Utah, never stopped hoping that someday someone from her family would reach out. Our first phone call lasted 4 hours. She told me about the excommunication, how the bishop had called her into his office and told her she was an abomination, how her own mother had refused to hug her goodbye. She told me about the decades of silence, the birthdays and holidays that passed without a word, the obituaries she watched for in Utah newspapers, always wondering if her parents had died, if her brother had died, if anyone would even tell her. "Your father wrote to me once," she said, her voice crackling through the phone. "In 1994, he said he was sorry. He said he understood now, that the church wasn't what he thought it was. He said he wanted to reconnect, to introduce me to his children. But then he never wrote again. I always wondered what happened. I knew what happened. President Jennings happened. The threat of discipline, the fear of losing everything, the choice between truth and comfort. My father had reached out to his sister in the same season he'd written that unsent letter to me, and then he'd retreated back into the safety of silence, leaving both of us alone in our separate prisons. The final document in the box was the letter my father had left for me. The one with my name on the cover of the notebook. For Rachel, when I'm gone. It was dated 2 weeks before his death. He must have known his heart was failing. He must have felt the end approaching and finally found the courage he'd lacked for 30 years. "My dearest daughter," he wrote, "if you're reading this, I am gone, and I can finally tell you the truth. I gave them my money, my time, my doubts, and my daughter. I watched you build a life on a foundation I knew was cracked, and I said nothing. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself. I was a coward, Rachel. I was a coward, and you paid the price. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know. It's not too late for you. You still have years ahead of you. You still have choices I was too afraid to make. Don't give them your grandchildren. Don't let the cycle continue. Be braver than I was. Be the person I should have been. I love you. I have always loved you, and I'm sorry for everything." I sat in that study until the sun went down, holding my father's final words, feeling something crack open inside me that had been sealed shut my whole life. Grief, yes. Anger, absolutely. But underneath it all, something unexpected, relief, permission. A door that had always been locked, suddenly swinging open. I confronted David that night. I showed him the letter about our arranged courtship. I asked him if he knew. He didn't deny it. He didn't even seem surprised that I'd found out. "I thought you knew," he said, and his voice was calm, almost dismissive. "I thought all temple marriages were like this. Our parents found good matches for us. What's wrong with that?" Everything. Everything was wrong with that. But David couldn't see it, and I realized he never would. He had been raised in the same system I had, fed the same lies, trained to see arranged partnership as divine guidance. He wasn't a villain. He was a victim who had become a perpetrator, passing down the same wounds he'd inherited. I filed for divorce 3 months later. David didn't fight it. The bishop tried to intervene, calling me in for meetings, warning me about breaking my temple covenants, reminding me that eternal families require sacrifice. I sat in his office and looked at the portrait of Jesus on the wall and felt nothing but exhaustion. "I'm done sacrificing," I told him. "I've given this church 52 years. I have nothing left." I submitted my resignation letter the following week. The process took 60 days. When the confirmation arrived, a single paragraph informing me that my name had been removed from church records, that my baptism and temple ordinances were null, that I was no longer a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I expected to feel loss. Instead, I felt like I was breathing for the first time. 3 of my 5 children stopped speaking to me. They see my departure as a betrayal, a rejection of everything they still believe. I pray they'll find their own truth someday, in their own time. I can't force it. I can only leave the door open and wait. My other 2 children, my youngest son and my middle daughter, have asked questions. Careful questions, quiet questions, the kind of questions I wish my father had let me ask 30 years ago. I answer them honestly. I share what I've learned. I let them make their own choices. I'd love to know. What moment in this story hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. I live alone now, in a small apartment in Salt Lake City, surrounded by boxes I still haven't fully unpacked. My walls are bare. My shelves are empty. I have no visiting teachers, no calling, no purpose handed to me by someone else. And I have never been happier. I used to think the church had taken everything from me. But standing in my kitchen last Tuesday morning, drinking coffee for the first time in my life, bitter and strange and utterly ordinary, I realized something my father never could. The cage had always been unlocked. The bars were made of stories. Stories I had been told, stories I told myself, stories I passed to my children like a genetic disease. The moment I stopped believing the story, the cage disappeared. It was never really about the church. It was about the courage to write my own story, to pick up the pen and start fresh on a blank page, even at 52, even with trembling hands, even without knowing how the next chapter would go. For the first time in my life, the pen is in my hand, and I'm just getting started.